The patrol SUV lay upside down in the ravine, metal twisted, windows shattered, and inside, a young officer pinned beneath the dashboard, his face streaked with blood that the cold hadn't yet managed to freeze. His breath fogged the broken glass as he whispered into a failing radio, "Officer down. Please." Max saw him first. The dog lunged toward the wreck without hesitation, as if he understood that a life was slipping away in the time it took the wind to change direction. By the time I reached the edge, the storm was closing in, snow piling against the overturned doors, trying to bury a man who was still fighting to stay conscious. And standing there, looking at him trapped in that broken shell of a vehicle, I realized this wasn't just a rescue. Something, or someone, had put him there. And the truth waiting under that storm was far darker than the night itself. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The cabin door shuddered once. The kind of sound that steals the breath from a room, as if the wood itself had been struck by something with weight and intention. A dull thud followed, heavier than the wind could claim, and then came the thin scrape of ice sliding down the grain, a sound so sharp it pulled the air taut. Raymond lifted his head from the small table where he'd been mending a strap on Max's harness, his hands instinctively stilling, the soldier in him waking before his thoughts did. Max was already on his feet, muscles tightening beneath his coat, ears cutting through the silence as if measuring the space between danger and certainty. Nothing else moved, but the night outside felt suddenly crowded, as though something unseen pressed its face against the door. Another scrape came, softer but closer, and Max lunged before Raymond even pushed back his chair. The dog's paws braced hard against the floorboards, his nose pressed sharply to the gap beneath the door, breath quickening in a rhythm that had saved their lives more than once. His growl rose low, steady, not born of anger, but of a promise. A vow carved into instinct. The kind that tells a man he's no longer alone in whatever is coming. Raymond took a single step toward him, the old ache in his left knee flaring, a reminder of a desert long behind him but never truly gone, and he felt the shift in the air that comes when the world tips from ordinary into something else. Then the radio on the table crackled to life, spitting static like sparks thrown from a frayed wire. At first it was only the storm's breath, but underneath it pulsed something human. A ragged inhale, a broken exhale, the fragile sound of someone fighting to stay present. Raymond turned slowly, eyes narrowing as the voice pushed through the noise. It came in thin, crushed fragments, barely holding itself together. "This is Officer Hale. Vehicle down. If anyone hears..." Static tore the rest apart. Raymond didn't move for half a heartbeat, the echo of that voice striking somewhere deep, somewhere he had sealed shut years ago. Max snapped the spell, jerking back from the door as if something outside had shifted. His growl sharpened, his body angled. He was waiting only for the hand that would unlatch the barrier between them and whatever waited in the storm. Raymond reached the door in 3 strides. His fingers hesitated only once, not from fear, but from memory. The familiar hesitation of a man who had opened too many doors in too many nights that didn't turn out the way he prayed they would. But Max was already braced against the frame, breath steaming, leash taut with urgency. Raymond released the latch. The door flew outward, nearly torn from his grip as the wind roared in with a violence that felt personal. Snow swept across the threshold in wild, blinding sheets, and Max plunged into it without hesitation. Raymond caught the leash with the speed of a man who once survived by reflex alone, his hand closing around the worn leather like grabbing onto an old truth he had tried to forget. The cold bit instantly into his face, carved into his lungs, but he pushed forward anyway, letting Max lead because the dog always sensed the edges of the world before he did. The storm swallowed the porch in seconds, reducing the distance between safety and the unknown to nothing but breath and instinct. Raymond squinted through the swirling white, his boots sinking deep, the wind dragging at his coat like fingers trying to pull him back. Something in that radio call, the fear behind the words, the way the voice slipped between breaths, had cracked open an old wound he no longer had the luxury to ignore. Max surged ahead, and Raymond followed, leaning into the blizzard, trusting the dog's certainty when his own felt thin. Then, 10 feet from the porch, Max stopped. Not a slowing, not a pause, a full, abrupt halt that yanked Raymond forward with a jolt. He caught himself, boots sliding, breath misting in hard bursts as he steadied his stance. Max didn't look back, his body angled low, taut, the line of his spine a quiet warning carved against the storm's chaos. Raymond followed his line of sight and saw it. A glove lay half buried in the snow, torn at the cuff as if ripped off in desperation. Snow clung to the fabric, but not in the way that comes with time. A streak of dark red cut across the palm, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen, glistening faintly in the storm's dim light. Raymond crouched, the cold stabbing through his knee, and brushed a thumb along the edge of the fabric. Warmth still clung to it. Someone had been here minutes ago. Someone who had bled. Someone who had reached this spot and then disappeared into the storm's white hunger. Max lifted his head slowly, breath rolling out in short clouds. His eyes fixed on a direction not chosen by guess or chance, but by a thread he sensed more than saw. The wind battered them, but Max stood firm, ears angled forward, the leash vibrating with the tension of a living compass pulling toward a truth buried somewhere in the dark. Raymond rose, gripping the leash tighter as the storm screamed across the tree line. He didn't need words from Max. The dog had already told him everything he needed to know, that someone out there was losing their battle with time, and that the night would not forgive hesitation. Then it came, faint at first, nearly lost beneath the howl of the wind. A metallic groan drifting through the snow, long and low, like the dying breath of steel being crushed under its own weight. It carried across the frozen ridge, swelling, collapsing, echoing off the unseen walls of the storm. Somewhere in the white, a vehicle was surrendering to the cold. Somewhere out there, a life hung in that sound. Max pulled forward once, sharply. Raymond followed without question. The night had cracked open for them both. Something shifted in the storm. Not louder, not clearer, simply closer, as if the night itself was breathing around them. The wind sharpened, gaining a fine metallic edge that scraped across Raymond's ears like a warning he had heard once on foreign soil. Pale reflections flitted in the distance, faint pulses swallowed and released by the whiteout, their rhythm too deliberate to belong to nature. Max slowed for the briefest second, head tilting, reading the air the way a seasoned tracker reads footprints. Then he surged forward again, plunging deeper into the drifts with a certainty that steadied Raymond even as the cold clawed at his ribs. Raymond leaned into the blizzard, one hand shielding his eyes, the other clamped tightly around Max's leash, the leather taut as a lifeline. The ground sloped downward beneath the storm's veil, and the wind carried a low groan, the strained metal sound of something broken still fighting against collapse. Raymond narrowed his gaze. Through the shifting curtain of snow, Dull lights flickered like wounded stars, blinking in and out, as if unsure they deserved to remain lit. With each step, the shapes sharpened. The tail end of a patrol SUV twisted awkwardly above a crater, its front buried under a thick crust of fractured ice. The air around the wreck felt different, hollowed, as if holding its breath. Snow piled around the vehicle's edges, forming a throat of white that swallowed sound and light alike. Max approached first, lowering his body, nostrils flaring with a slow, methodical pull of air. His breath steamed upward and vanished into the storm. But his posture tightened with each inch. Raymond's boots slid against ice as he circled toward the shattered driver's side window. The beam of his small flashlight cut through the dark interior, revealing a figure slumped forward, pinned by twisted metal and the ruin of a dashboard. Officer Lucas Hale, younger than Raymond expected, early 30s, face drained of color except where thin cuts traced lines of red across pale skin. His patrol jacket hung torn around the shoulders, exposing shards of metal embedded like cruel, glittering teeth. His breaths came shallow and uneven, fogging the air in front of him in faint, trembling bursts. The storm pressed in around them, but inside that broken shell of steel, there was a quieter storm unfolding. The storm of a man fighting not to disappear. Max moved before Raymond could react. The dog slipped through the shattered window with a practiced grace, ignoring the jagged edges of glass that could have torn less careful paws. His body curled immediately against Lucas's chest, a warm weight grounding the officer's frantic breathing. Lucas stiffened, then exhaled a strangled, half-disbelieving sound that was almost a laugh. You're real." The words were faint, more breath than voice, but they carried a kind of gratitude that needed no volume. Raymond climbed closer, bracing an arm on the SUV's frame as he angled himself into the narrow space beside them. His movements slowed, steady, the way they had been when he wore a different uniform and answered calls that never ended with certainty. His fingers traced lightly along Lucas's wrist, feeling for a pulse still present but fluttering, then moved to assess the contortions of the trapped leg and the sharp angles of debris. He didn't speak. There was no need. His hands already spoke fluently in the language of triage, risk, and decisions made in the shadows of time. Max's ears twitched suddenly. It was a small thing, a shift of cartilage, a subtle angle, but it rippled through Raymond's awareness like a dropped stone. The dog's body tensed, not with fear but alertness, the kind that rises when something unseen moves just out of sight. Raymond withdrew his hand slowly, watching Max's gaze drift toward the open snow, pupils narrowing as he caught a scent carried on the wind. Max backed out of the vehicle with deliberate slowness, his paws finding purchase on the ice with the ease of a creature shaped by intuition. His nose lowered to the ground, tracing arcs across the snow as if following threads invisible to the human eye. Raymond turned on instinct, scanning the storm-swept ridge, though the blizzard reduced distance to little more than shifting light and shadow. He stepped toward Max, and that was when he saw them. Footprints. Not smudges, not guesses. Clear impressions punched into the snow by someone heavier, someone moving with force rather than fear. They led away from the crash in a purposeful line, then curved back in a wide arc as if circling the wreck, watching, thinking, choosing. The edges hadn't softened under fresh snow, which meant they didn't belong to the storm's early hours. They belonged to now, to moments ago. A prickle crawled up Raymond's spine. This wasn't the pattern of someone fleeing. It was the pattern of someone returning, someone weighing what else the night might still ask of them. Max pressed his nose into one of the prints, inhaling deeply. His shoulders stiffened. He followed the tracks slowly, the leash sliding across Raymond's palm like a whisper asking to be trusted. The wind softened for a moment, creating a pocket of relative stillness around them, a small, suspended breath carved out of the storm's fury. In that pocket, Raymond heard another sound layered beneath the wind. A faint, rhythmic pulse, broken and uneven, like a voice caught in a mechanical throat. Max's path led to a mound of snow partially shielding something dark and rectangular. He brushed aside the powder with one paw, exposing a battered radio, half cracked along the side as though struck by a blunt force. The antenna flickered weakly, and the speaker emitted a fractured series of whispers, tones too warped, too layered to resemble the cadence of human speech. It sounded almost like syllables that had forgotten how to belong to a voice. Raymond bent down, sweeping snow from the device, his breath hanging still in the frozen air. The light on the radio blinked irregularly, each pulse dimming as if losing strength. Max stood rigid beside him, gaze fixed not on the radio, but on the drifts beyond, where the footprints dissolved into white distance. The dog didn't growl. He didn't need to. His silence told Raymond enough. Someone had been here. Someone had left this radio behind, and someone might still be close enough to hear them breathing. The storm pressed in once more, erasing the brief stillness they'd been granted. The blizzard thickened, swallowing shapes, muting colors, tightening the world around them to a ring of wind and uncertainty. Raymond closed his hand around the cracked radio, feeling the cold bite into his skin. For a moment, the whispers inside the device grew sharper, their distortion bending into something almost like a word. Max stepped forward, head low, body angled toward the unseen ridge. The leash vibrated with a taut, quiet urgency. Raymond exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the storm's push, and looked in the same direction. Something was out there. Something that did not belong to the crash. Something that had walked toward them before turning back into the white. And they were no longer alone on that ridge. The frost on the radio reminded Raymond of the thin ice that used to form on the edges of his helmet during desert nights. Never enough to freeze, just enough to whisper that danger always had more than one face. He brushed the crystals from the cracked speaker, his glove dragging slowly across the cold metal. And for a moment, the sound beneath the static seemed to echo from a place much older than this storm. It pulsed once, as if gathering breath, then shaped a single word with a jagged, unnatural edge. Payback. The syllables weren't loud, yet they carried the weight of something personal, something that had been waiting for years to be spoken. Lucas stiffened beside him, fingers trembling as they clutched Raymond's sleeve. His face, already pale from the cold, seemed to drain further as he forced his voice through the shiver climbing up his spine. He wasn't alone. He flagged me down, said he needed help. Then he forced me off the road. The words drifted out like broken branches, collapsing under their own heaviness. But Raymond barely heard them. The storm above them wailed against the ridge, and beneath it rose a quieter sound only he could feel. The low throb of memory pressing its way through old cracks. He steadied his breath, but it did little to settle the past. A dim image surfaced, the red dust of another country swirling at his boots, a young private yelling his name, the sudden eruption of light followed by silence thick enough to smother the world. He had carried that night for years, even after he stopped admitting it. The guilt settled in his chest, like cold iron, sharper in moments when another man's life hung by a thread nearby. The echo of that memory merged too easily with the storm's wind now, blurring where the present ended and the past began. Max sensed the shift long before Raymond pulled himself out of that downward spiral. The dog pressed his head firmly against Raymond's hand, nudging with a gentle insistence that anchored him to the cold, to the snow, to the breath fogging in front of him. Raymond exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in his chest ease just enough to pull him back into his own body. The wind carried the scent of pine and metal, both sharp, both unforgiving, and something else, faint but chilling, like a trace of sweat steeped in old fear. Then Max's posture changed. His ears snapped upward, turning west like compass needles drawn to an unseen magnetic field. His body tightened, one paw lifting from the snow, as if preparing to move before a command existed. He tested the wind with slow, deliberate breaths, each inhale deepening the line of tension down his spine. Raymond followed the dog's gaze into the storm, though all he saw were shifting walls of white. But Max saw more. The same scent that lingered on the torn glove, the cracked radio, the footprints that had circled the crash with calculated patience. The sense of being watched thickened, turning the air into something denser than snow. Raymond shifted his grip around Lucas's torso, guiding him carefully out of the shallow ditch that surrounded the wreck. Lucas leaned heavily on him, every exhale ragged, each step a battle against pain and cold. Max moved ahead, not fast but sure, his tail low, his focus locked on something the storm had not yet revealed. The three of them approached a cluster of boulders half swallowed by the drifting snow. The rocks jutted out like the ribs of a long dead beast, their surfaces coated in ice that glimmered faintly under the fractured stormlight. Max slowed, circling once before lowering his nose to a patch where the snow seemed disturbed in a way the wind alone couldn't account for. Raymond felt Lucas tense, as if the very shape of the shadows told him they were nearing the heart of something that should have remained buried. At the base of the largest boulder, half hidden beneath a thin veil of snow, sat a small piece of metal. Its edges were worn smooth, the surface dulled by time, but the chain looped through it shimmered faintly as Max brushed snow aside with his paw. Raymond leaned down, his gloved fingers closing around the object, with the careful reverence of someone picking up a relic from a ghost. When he lifted it, the snow fell away, revealing a name stamped into the metal in lines he had once memorized in youth. His breath caught. His heart paused. The dog tag was real. The name was real. A soldier from his own unit. A man buried 10 years ago. A memory carved into stone long before this storm. For a long moment, Raymond stood still, the blizzard swirling around him while his thoughts froze in place. Lucas watched him, confusion and dawning fear mixing in his eyes. Max sat motionless beside Raymond's leg, his gaze sharp, as if he understood the gravity in the air even without knowing the story. Raymond did not speak. He couldn't. His throat closed around words he thought he had locked away for the rest of his life. The wind shifted suddenly, dragging snow sideways like a curtain being torn. In that moment, Raymond realized the truth that no part of him had been prepared to face. The man they were dealing with wasn't a stranger. The storm hadn't brought them to some random stretch of misfortune. It had led them into the path of a ghost, wearing the weight of a decade-old grief, a grief Raymond had unknowingly helped shape. Max let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a warning threaded with sorrow. Raymond closed his fist around the dog tag, the cold metal biting into his palm, grounding him in a reality he didn't want, but couldn't deny. Lucas tried to speak, the fog of his breath trembling, but whatever he meant to say dissolved into the roar of the storm. The three of them stood in a fragile silence, surrounded by the white chaos of the ridge, each bearing the weight of truths colliding in the dark. The snow thickened again, obscuring the world, beyond a few feet. Raymond heard his heartbeat, slow and deliberate, echoing in his ears like the drumbeat of approaching consequence. The air felt tighter, as if the mountain itself held its breath, waiting for a revelation that hovered just beyond sight. Then, without warning, a sound broke through the storm, the crisp, unmistakable crunch of a footstep behind them. Not hurried, not uncertain, slow, deliberate. The kind of step a man takes when he wants to be heard, but not seen fully. When he wants to announce his presence without revealing his intention. Max pivoted instantly, placing himself between Raymond, Lucas, and the direction of the sound. His body formed a barrier of muscle and instinct, his stance wide, his breath steady despite the cold gnawing at his fur. The leash trembled against Raymond's wrist as Max leaned forward slightly, ready to confront whatever had followed them into this moment. The storm swirled, and a darker shape began to form within it. Something, or someone, had found them. And the night had not yet revealed what it intended to take. The storm grew harsher with each breath, as though the mountain had decided to deepen the night rather than end it. Wind tore across the ridge in sharp, spiraling currents, stinging exposed skin and bending the tops of the pines until they groaned like old ships in a restless sea. Snow thickened into a white wall, swallowing distance and sound, shrinking the world down to the narrow space Raymond, Lucas, and Max occupied. Even the light from Raymond's flashlight wavered, trembling in the storm as if it feared what it might reveal next. In that trembling circle of pale gold, the air felt alive, stretched thin between danger and fate. A shape darkened the storm before it fully formed. At first, it was only a blur of motion weaving through the whiteout, but as it drew closer, the outline sharpened into something undeniably human. The man emerged from the blizzard slowly, each step weighted with years rather than snow. His winter coat hung in torn, frayed sheets around a gaunt frame, patches of frost clinging to the seams. His face bore the hollow look of someone who had walked far with grief as his only companion, eyes sunken yet burning with a fierce, brittle light. The grief was old, but its fire was not. Raymond felt the name before he said it. Aaron Cutter. The last time he'd seen those eyes, they had held a younger kind of anger, untempered, raw, searching for someone to blame. Now they held something heavier, something sharpened into purpose by a decade of silence. The wind whipped strands of his hair across his face, but his gaze never wavered from the dog tag still clutched in Raymond's glove. He lifted one shaking finger toward Lucas. His voice broke like thin ice. He let my brother freeze in the desert, just drove past him. I saw the footage. He deserves the same. Lucas opened his mouth, but pain forced the words back, leaving only a strangled breath. His knees buckled, and Raymond tightened his arm around him, feeling the tremor of fear and cold radiate through the injured man's body. The accusation hung in the air, heavy, irreversible, and the storm seemed to pause, listening for Raymond's response. Max stepped forward first, not with violence, but with certainty. His growl threaded through the wind, deep and anchored, a sound born not of hatred but duty, a warning shaped by the instinct to protect the wounded at his back. His stance lowered, paws digging into the snow, his body angled between the men he trusted and the man shaped by sorrow. Raymond inhaled slowly, The cold burned his lungs, grounding him in the moment the way Max always did. Aaron, you weren't there. Your brother died before anyone could reach him. No one abandoned him. His voice was quiet, strained at the edges, the weight of memory dulling its sharpness. He didn't defend himself with force. He knew grief well enough to understand it did not yield to volume. Aaron's jaw trembled, his breath hitched. The snow clung to his eyelashes like ash. Grief convinces a man of things logic can never touch. And this man's grief had too long been left alone in the dark. He lifted a crowbar, not with speed, with decision. The movement was slow enough for Raymond to see the moment Aaron's rage finally found a direction. Lucas sagged against him, too weak to move, and Raymond felt the blow forming in the air before it even began its arc. But Max saw it too. The dog lunged not toward Aaron, but sideways, just enough to disrupt the path of the descending metal, redirecting it with the blunt impact of his shoulder. Snow burst upward like smoke from a collapsed wall. Aaron's feet slipped on the ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. His body tilted dangerously, and then the ground simply wasn't there anymore. He slid toward the cliff's edge, fingers clawing at the snow until a dead branch jutting from the frozen earth caught the crook of his arm. His body dangled above the ravine, legs kicking against open air, the storm's roar rising from below as if the mountain itself exhaled frost. Raymond didn't think. He didn't choose. He moved. 3 strides carried him to the edge. His boots cut deep into the snow, anchoring him as his hand shot out to grab Aaron's wrist. Their eyes met, 2 men carved differently by the same war. Aaron's were wide, not with anger now, but with the dawning horror of a man who finally understood what he had almost become. Snow swirled around them like dust caught in a beam of dying light. "Don't," Aaron gasped, voice cracking under the storm and the weight of confession. "I don't deserve—" Raymond tightened his grip, the dog tag pressing cold against his palm. "I lost men too," he said, each word shaped by a wound older than the storm. "And I still wished someone had reached for them. Let me reach for you." That was one of the 2 lines he was allowed tonight. The kind of truth that carried more warmth than the fire he no longer had. Aaron's breath stuttered. Something fragile shifted inside his expression. A realization, a surrender, a breaking open. But then the branch groaned, cracked, tilted. The world tilted with it. Raymond dropped lower, muscles straining, snow biting into his knees. Behind him, Max planted himself, paws digging deep into the thick snowbank. The leash stretched between them like a lifeline connecting generations of loyalty. Dog to man, man to second chances. Max's weight countered Raymond's slipping hold, giving him inches he wouldn't have had alone. The ravine edge shuddered, split. The earth beneath Raymond's boots lurched. Snow cascaded downward in long white ribbons. The wind surged upward, carrying the cold breath of the abyss. Lucas shouted something behind them. Or maybe it was only the storm pretending to speak with a human voice. Raymond didn't look back. He didn't dare. His entire world narrowed to the wrist in his grip, the cracking ledge beneath him, and the dog bracing all 3 lives against the pull of gravity. For a fleeting moment, time froze. The land beneath them hung on the thin line between holding and giving way. Then the ledge groaned once more, a deep, ominous vibration rising through the earth. 1 more second. 1 inch. And all 3 would fall. For a brief, breathless moment, the storm seemed to pause. The wind still moved. The snow still swirled, but something in the night loosened, as if the mountain itself exhaled after holding a tension too heavy for too long. Raymond felt the shift before he understood it. The world had been pulled taut around their struggle, and now, for the first time, there was space to breathe. The cliff's broken edge lay behind them like a wound barely closed, and ahead stretched only the cold silence of survival. It was the kind of silence that comes after a truth has brushed close enough to be felt, but not yet spoken. Max stood braced behind Raymond, paws buried in deep snow, fur stiffened by frost and effort. The dog's chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, each exhale steaming into the frigid air like a vow made visible. With Max's weight anchoring him and Lucas dragging himself forward despite the pain that bent him in half, Raymond pulled Aaron Cutter back onto solid ground. The man collapsed immediately, his knees buckling, palms sinking into the snow, not in fear but in surrender. The sobs that tore from his chest sounded raw, almost childlike, the kind that comes when grief finally cracks open after being locked away for years. Lucas watched him from the ground, his breath shallow, frost clinging to the edges of his lashes. "You saved him," he whispered, voice thin as paper. "Even after what he did." The wind caught the words and softened them, carrying them across the ridge like a confession only the night was meant to hear. Raymond shook his head, a slow, worn-out motion shaped by battles fought long before this storm. "Storms take enough lives," he said softly. "We don't need to add to the count." It was the first truth that felt warm in hours. Aaron pressed a trembling hand over his face, fingers digging into the cold skin as if trying to hold together the pieces of a world he never properly understood. Snowflakes melted along his knuckles, leaving trails that looked almost like tears not yet fallen. "I didn't want to kill anyone," he choked out, words frayed at the edges. "I just wanted the hurting to stop." His shoulders curled inward, his posture collapsing into itself, forming the outline of a man who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. Max stepped toward him with the tentative caution of someone approaching a wounded creature. His tail remained still, not raised in threat nor tucked in fear, only held in that subtle middle place where dogs decide whether a human's heart can still be reached. His eyes softened, the dark brown of them deepening with an understanding only animals seem capable of offering without judgment. Aaron looked up, startled by the closeness, as if surprised that anything in the world might still approach him gently. Slowly, almost as if his hand wasn't sure it remembered how, he reached out and touched Max's head. His fingers hovered first, then settled into the fur, hesitant, reverent. It was the first gentle act he had offered anyone in years. Max did not move away. He simply accepted the hand, accepted the trembling, accepted the human behind it. In that moment, Raymond saw something in Aaron shift. Not forgiveness, not healing, but the faintest easing of a knot tied too tightly for too long. The sky above them darkened, then brightened with a rhythmic pulse. At first the sound came faintly, little more than a distant tremble of the air. But then it grew, steady, mechanical, cutting through the storm with purpose. Rotor blades. A rescue chopper somewhere beyond the whiteout, pushing toward them with the promise of warmth, hands, light, and second chances. Raymond let out a long breath, the first that didn't hurt his ribs since the night began. But relief rarely arrives alone. Lucas's eyes rolled back, his body slumping sideways as if the last threads of strength had snapped all at once. Max barked sharply, a sudden, urgent sound that cut through the storm like a signal flare. Raymond lunged, catching Lucas before he hit the snow, feeling the limp weight settle into his arms. "Stay with me, son. Stay." The words broke from him, raw and unguarded, carrying the pain of all the nights he had failed to say them to others. Time stilled again, but differently this time. The storm faded to a whisper, the ridge a fading shape around them, and even the chopper's blades seemed to dim beneath the pounding of Raymond's heartbeat. Max stood at Lucas's other side, pressing against him the same way he had in the ruined SUV, lending warmth, lending breath, refusing to let the cold claim another. Aaron knelt nearby, forgotten for a moment, watching a tableau of loyalty he had never witnessed up close. Then Lucas breathed, weak, shuddering, but real. Raymond felt the tremor roll through him, a fragile mixture of relief and fear and gratitude that the world allowed one more life to remain. Max's posture eased, though his ears stayed pinned forward, listening for any sign of change. The wind swept past them, colder now, but somehow less cruel, as if the storm had recognized what mercy looks like. They stayed like that until the rescue team's lights cut through the white. Medics rushed toward them, voices muffled under the wind, hands reaching out with blankets and stretchers and all the tools that turn hope into action. Raymond surrendered Lucas into their care slowly, reluctantly, as if letting go too quickly might undo the fragile thread holding the officer to the world. Aaron stepped back, folding into himself, the dog tag still glinting faintly in Raymond's fist. He looked smaller now, not just from exhaustion, but from truth catching up to him. His gaze darted between the medics, Raymond, and the dog, as if trying to understand how the night had unfolded into something he hadn't intended and didn't know how to escape. As one medic adjusted Lucas's oxygen mask, Aaron leaned slightly toward Raymond. His voice came out quiet, almost lost under the rotor wash, but the words struck with the force of a blow delivered straight to the soul. "He wasn't the one who left my brother." A breath, a tremor. "You were." The truth landed with the weight of a decade, not shouted, not accusing, simply delivered. The wind swallowed the silence that followed, drawing it deep into the storm's belly. Raymond didn't flinch, not outwardly. But something in his eyes shifted, the way a candle trembles when a door opens unexpectedly. It was not guilt alone that filled them, but recognition. The sudden resurfacing of a night he had buried so deeply, he no longer remembered the shape of it. And Max, sensing what humans often hide too well, stepped closer to Raymond, leaning into his leg, grounding him the way he had grounded him so many times before. Loyalty, once again, holding a man upright at the edge of a truth too heavy to face alone. The storm howled softly, as if acknowledging the cost of salvation. The world softened after the helicopter rose into the thinning storm, its blades carving brief circles of light before disappearing beyond the ridge. Snow drifted lazily in its wake, no longer driven by rage but falling in gentle spirals, as if the night had signed its surrender. The echo of the rescue faded into the vast quiet, leaving behind a landscape washed clean by wind and fear. In that stillness, the ridge felt almost sacred, a place where something had broken, but something else had been repaired in its stead. Aaron Cutter stood between two deputies, a figure no longer distorted by anger but by exhaustion, the kind that follows years of carrying a burden no one else could see. His wrists were bound, yet there was a strange calm in his posture, an acceptance settling over him like a long-delayed exhale. As they guided him across the snow, he stopped once, turning back toward Raymond. His voice trembled in the air, softer than the wind around them. I'm sorry. For the wrong man. For the wrong anger. Raymond didn't speak. He simply nodded, a quiet gesture that held more forgiveness than words ever could. Some apologies belonged not to the ears, but to the soul, and this one found its place without sound. The deputies led Aaron away, their shadows shrinking into the pale horizon. For the first time all night, the storm began to open its hands. The clouds thinned, the wind eased, and a faint strand of light traced the edge of the eastern sky. Raymond watched it slowly ascend, that fragile beauty rising out of the same darkness that had nearly taken so much. It was the kind of sunrise that didn't simply brighten the world. It touched it gently, like a hand laid on a tired shoulder, reminding it to rest. Max settled beside him, his fur damp and cold, but his presence warm and unwavering. He leaned his weight into Raymond's leg, not asking for comfort, but offering it. The dog's breath rose in steady clouds, each one a quiet assurance that they were still here, still tethered to the earth despite what the night had tried to take. Raymond rested a gloved hand on Max's back, feeling the slow rise and fall beneath the thick coat, and something unknotted inside him, a tension he had carried longer than he ever admitted. The ridge stretched silently before them, the snow beginning to glisten under the newborn light. Raymond let his gaze follow the soft contours left by the storm, tracing the path they had taken, the scars cut into the drifts, the fragile places where the earth had nearly given way. It struck him that survival was not always about strength. Sometimes it was about the willingness to keep moving even when the ground threatened to disappear beneath your feet. And sometimes it was about having a companion who sensed the danger before you did, and stayed anyway. He inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs with a clarity that felt almost medicinal. The worst was behind them, not erased, never erased, but faced, endured, and softened by the dawn's quiet mercy. He reached into his coat, pulling out the old notebook with weathered edges, the one he carried not for lists or plans, but for the thoughts he couldn't say aloud. The pages fluttered in the breeze as he opened to a clean sheet, his pencil pausing in midair before finding its first line. We are all snow in the wind, but sometimes a hand reaches out, and suddenly, we are not drifting alone. The words settled onto the page softly, as though they had been waiting for the right night to be written. Raymond looked at them for a moment, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tired, grateful curve. Not a smile, not fully, but something close, something peaceful. He closed the notebook gently, slipping it back into his coat. Max nudged his hand again, this time tucking his head beneath it with quiet insistence. The gesture was small, but its meaning was vast. It claimed the silence, the moment, the promise that neither of them would carry their burdens alone again. Raymond let his fingers sink into the fur between Max's ears, feeling the warmth there despite the cold still clinging to the air. The dog leaned harder, grounding him with the simple truth of presence. The sky brightened slowly, the pale ribbon of light widening into soft gold. The storm clouds retreated across the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like gentle fingers toward the valley below. The world no longer shook with danger. It breathed instead, a long, slow exhale that matched Raymond's own. Snowflakes shimmered in the rising light, drifting down in delicate patterns, not chaotic, not violent, but radiant, as if the storm's remnants had chosen to fall beautifully. Raymond lowered himself onto the ridge's edge, one knee in the snow, Max settling beside him. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt whole. He realized then that belonging was not a place or a past to reclaim. It was a moment when fear loosened its grip, when grief softened, when hope found a quiet place to land. And this ridge at this dawn was that place. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the light rest against his face. Max shifted beside him, keeping watch the way he always did, steady, loyal, unspoken. When Raymond opened his eyes again, the sun was climbing higher, breaking fully through the last shreds of cloud. The world glowed around them. The light stayed, and Max stayed with it. When the world finally grows quiet after a night like that, something inside you changes. Not in a way others would notice, but in the way you breathe, in the way you look at the morning light and realize it feels different than it did the day before. Maybe it's because courage rarely arrives with noise. More often it comes softly, in the form of a steady hand, a loyal companion, or a choice made simply because it is right. We learn in these bitter hours that kindness is not a grand gesture but a quiet persistence. And hope, fragile as it seems, has a way of lingering in the places where fear once lived. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They settle into us, remind us that even on the coldest days, we are never entirely alone. There is a warmth that stays, carried in the loyalty of a dog, the resolve of a weary man, and the soft promise of a new sunrise. And if you let it, that warmth follows you long after the storm has passed. If this moment stayed with you, I hope you'll wander back here someday. There will always be another story waiting in the quiet.